Welcome to the Coroner's Report, Episode 1, John Markle, An Act of Macabre Benevolence. Before we begin, please remember this is a true crime podcast with adult themes. Please be aware when possible, the voice of the actual person is used in these podcasts. However, several witnesses are deceased and some chose not to be recorded, and still others agreed for their words to be used, but not their real names. Please remember to like and follow us on all social media platforms and be sure to share us with your friends. All suspects or persons of interest mentioned are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
My name is John Markle. My mother is Academy Award-winning actress Mercedes McCambridge, and this awful story is true. Let me take you back to November 1987, on a dark and stormy night in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was caught red-handed in a crime designed by me only to benefit my mother. There was no other way out. I had devised this horrifying ending a week before. I changed my will, knowing there would be no survivors. I bought a Halloween mask, hoping the girls wouldn't know who was holding the guns. I sat down to write. I poured my heart and soul out on 12 pages. See, I was raised by live-in maids and relatives. My very existence from inception carried with it the responsibility of saving a bad marriage. You have never been there for me when the chips were down. I tried to get your love by academic achievements, gifts, and by taking this enormous personal risk to increase your wealth. Thanks for all your help. You said when a child cries, walk away from them. Don't let them make a fool of you. I wreck your Mercedes. I was in the intensive care unit for 3 months. The doctors thought I would die. I am released from the hospital. Less than 2 weeks later, you were drunk and told me to get out of your apartment. A few days later, we were supposed to meet. I kept calling you. No answer. I call a cab and go to your apartment. My head is still wrapped in bandages and gauze. I break in the window and get inside. I turn on a light and see you naked on the floor, pills and bottles all over, and your suicide note. Thanks for all your help. You lecture to my daughter, Amy, about the fact she didn't hold or open the car door for you. You reminded her that grandmother was really 2 words, and that she was not treating you so grand. Thanks for all your help. My problems at Stevens Investments. Initially you say, well, we can work this out. I never indicated once that any of this was your fault. You called me a liar, a cheat, a criminal, a bum. You saw dollar signs, that's why you've changed your mind. But why did I do it? I wished you'd never done a lot of the things you did. Is this clear to you? That you have hurt every member of my family. That you have hurt me. I think you are incurably angry. You put your God in whatever drawer you want. Leave mine alone. I have broken man's law. You have not. I have not broken God's law. You have. Night, Mother.
Welcome to the Coroner's Report. I'm the coroner, Steve Nawojczyk. The John Markle case is one that stayed with me all of these years. I worked the case, and it was like none I had ever seen before. In reviewing the matter and speaking with Mike Roche, the lead investigator, Richard Lawrence, who was Markle's attorney, and Todd Armstrong, the first officer on the scene, we have all felt the weight of this case even after all of these years.
This isn't a whodunit, it's a why. Why did John Markle annihilate his entire family that stormy night in 1987? Our story starts not in the 1980s or even in Arkansas, but 40 years earlier in Hollywood, California.
Markle had lived an unusual childhood. His mother, Mercedes McCambridge, came to Hollywood in the early 40s looking to become a star. That was her one goal in life, and nothing and no one would stand in her way, not even her son. Markle was born in 1941 in Hollywood, and a few years later his mother would win an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in All the King's Men. Mercedes' dreams were coming true. She appeared in Giant and other big movies of the 50s, but by the 60s her career was on the decline and her alcoholism had taken over. She was a mess. In the 70s, she ended up voicing the demon's voice in The Exorcist and garnered some acknowledgement from that role, but for the most part, Hollywood had passed her by.
In 1981, Mercedes became an author when she penned her own autobiography, The Quality of Mercy. During her press tours for the book, we discover a little insight into who Mercedes McCambridge was.
I think life is very hard to survive. I really do. I think it's a rough go a lot of the time. It seems to me that for me it was. I knew that I had to tell the truth. There was very little point in doing this book. And I believe I have told the truth, although I am a liar by nature. I lie about everything. But when it comes to the real things, I think I try very hard to be truthful. I don't want to hurt anybody through malice. If someone is hurt by something I've written, I haven't done it maliciously. I think malice offends the person who inflicts it more than it ever hurts the person for whom it is intended. And I think that's true about viciousness. A vicious person always falls on his own sword. I think Montaigne said that. And I think that's true. But if I have seemed less than kind, for example, people keep talking about how I wrote that Joan Crawford was a mean, rotten egg lady. Well, when I was a little girl, when I got mad at you or anybody else, I'd say you're nothing but a dirty, really mean, rotten egg person. That's all you are. You're just dirty old mean, rotten egg. But that's how I felt about Joan Crawford. I didn't like her, but she didn't like me first.
I always thought that Mercedes McCambridge was nuttier than squirrel shit, and I came to believe that John Markle was nutty as squirrel shit, too.
John Markle worked hard to be the perfect son, the perfect husband, the perfect father. John was the caretaker. John took care of Mercedes through her drunken benders, her suicide attempts, Hollywood feuds with other actresses like Joan Crawford, and multiple marriages and boyfriends. John's childhood was truly a Hollywood nightmare.
No one ever said that John Markle was dumb. In fact, he was brilliant. He graduated with his master's degree from the University of California at Los Angeles in 1968 and then earned his Ph.D. in economics. He married his lovely wife, Christine, and they started their little family in Dallas, Texas, where John had taken a job with Solomon Brothers.
John Markle had been kind of the boy wonder of the investment community and had settled in the late 1970s in Little Rock, Arkansas, with his wife and his two beautiful little girls. He had come to Little Rock to work for the largest private investment firm west of the Mississippi, and life for the Markles was comfortable. They lived in a large older home in a neighborhood rich in history near the Arkansas governor's mansion. But the area, well, it was on the decline. It was one of those neighborhoods with magnificent mansions. And 10 short years later, those mansions would be cut up into apartments. The scent of poverty, drugs, and desperation hung in the air. But that came later. John had gone to work at Stevens Investments, running essentially what was a one-man futures trading department. John even made vice president in just 8 months. Life was good. Better than good. The girls were involved in school activities and dance class and church. Christine was a social butterfly. According to Richard Lawrence, John's attorney, this was the typical Little Rock family. While John might have been a little different, there wasn't anything to worry about.
He was in his own world. He was highly intelligent. John had a computer mind that retained an awful lot of information. It was just that I never, ever felt like he was evil. I think in hindsight, if anything, he was desperately trying to win his mother's approval. More than anything, for whatever it is, perhaps his childhood, but it was a constant, I'm pleasing mommy. I never felt like he was weird, that you'd want to stay away from him. But in my relationship with him and with his wife, Christine, and with the two girls, they were normal as anybody. And John was the one who was kind of quirky. It wasn't a malicious thing. It wasn't an evil thing. It wasn't threatening. It was just, he was quirky, just an odd duck.
The masterful life carefully cultivated by John Markle came crashing down in early October 1987. It was a fluke that John's dirty deeds were revealed. John had been a naughty boy. He had embezzled money from his employer, but that money didn't go into John's bank account. It went into his mother's. About $1.4 million was missing. John Markle had full run of the trading department. His mother, Mercedes, had given him $600,000 to invest, but she claimed she only wanted him to invest in safe investments. She had been a child of the Depression, and gambling on the market wasn't something she claimed to be interested in at all. But John desperately wanted to please Mother. So within just a few years, Mercedes' investment grew from $600,000 to over $1 million.
Little Rock Police Department Detective Mike Roche led the investigation into the financial aspects of the crime.
So I was assigned to, at that time, it was called the larceny squad. Today's, you would call it probably the economic crimes unit. And so we investigated, forgeries, embezzlements, credit card fraud.
The scam that Markle came up with wasn't necessarily all that ingenious, but it sure did get the job done.
In some ways, on the surface, it kind of looked complex, but, when you boiled it down, it really wasn't. That the way he had it set up was that he had a long-term arrangement with a number of employees with this Chicago commodities firm called Gelderman. What he would do is when he was making trades in the morning, everything was hectic on the trading floor, and they would just barely take the trading information and say, we'll call you back, and they would hang up and then execute the trades on the floor. When things had finally started calming down in the afternoon, they would then call him back and say, hey, what account does that get attributed to? And by this point, he would see whether or not that trade was profitable or whether it was a loss. If it was profitable, well, then he would put that into his mother's account, which was under the name of Mercedes McCambridge. And then if it was a losing trade, it would go back into the Stevens house account.
According to Detective Mike Roche, it was a fluke that Markle even got caught.
So what happened was Elder was sending out the daily equity report to Stevens and apparently had inadvertently included the McCambridge account. The compliance department for Stevens questioned, well, who is this Mercedes McCambridge? And that's when one of the employees said, well, that's John Markle's mother. So they said, well, we need to get more accounting on that. And so they called back Elder to get that. Somebody at Elder said, hey, listen, just to let you know, he's been doing this over at Gelderman as well.
And that's when people realized there was a problem.
So I sat down and started, culling through records. I went over to Stevens and interviewed some of their employees, started preparing subpoenas for bank records and checking accounts, went from there.
Richard Lawrence was John Markle's attorney and had been working toward a resolution.
I really started working with him with the idea of, okay, how can we resolve this situation? And we were moving toward at least discussions about how to sort of resolve it. This was all kept very hush-hush at that time. There was nothing in the paper, to my knowledge. There was, Stevens cut him and cut him off. The thing about it was that, we had been working on an avenue to resolve the issues. He was engaged with that.
Whit Stevens, the founder of Stevens Investments, was a smart man. You don't own the largest privately held investment firm west of the Mississippi without being smart. He had weathered other scandals in the past, but Whit simply didn't want this story to hit the press. So after firing Markle in November of 1987, he proposed several different repayment plans.
I know that there was negotiations that was going on. Phil Schellenberger was the compliance officer for Stevens, and they initially confronted John Markle. He initially denied it, and then when more evidence was produced, they called him back in again, said, hey, listen, you're going to have to come up with this money. With that, he was looking at losing his securities license, which was everything. Obviously, his reputation would have been ruined.
John was desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. But this would shock the small town of Little Rock and vibrate throughout the state and across the country all the way to Hollywood.
During the course of the investigation, the one thing we found was that he was cashing a huge amount of personal checks.
$600 to $1,000 a week in 1987 dollars was quite a bit of change.
So we don't know where all that cash was going.
Whit Stevens proposed that John convince his mother to leave the $1 million in the investment account, drawing interest off the money for the rest of her life. But upon her death, that account would become property of Stevens. Considering Mercedes survived this ghastly crime, living another 17 years, this plan could have worked. But Mercedes said no. She didn't just say no. She destroyed her only son with her acidic words. She emasculated him. John Markle began carefully planning his exit. He wasn't going to exit this world alone. No, he couldn't possibly leave his wife and 2 daughters to fend alone in this world with no money. They depended on him to be the provider. What would the girls do without dance class? What would Christine, his wife, do without her society fundraisers? No, he wouldn't die alone, but he would die last.
A week before that deadly night, John wrote a will by hand replacing his old will, and the new will was written with no provision for a surviving spouse or 2 young children. Police found a rental movie in the VCR. The last movie his 9 and 13-year-old daughters would see was Nightmare on Elm Street, just hours before their very own nightmare began. But the creepiest and most unusual item was the old man rubber mask found right beside John Markle's body. The mask was covered with blood splatter. Blood from his wife and his daughter proved to investigators that Markle had worn this hideous mask as he annihilated his entire family.
4 a.m., John phoned his attorney, Richard Lawrence.
My real involvement began when I get this phone call that night. Everything seemed to follow after that phone call. The phone rang here at the house. My wife answered the phone, and she said, John Markle called and wants you to come down immediately. Then what happened, because I remember that I said, well, I'll go down, later on when the sun comes up. My wife said, no, he wants it right now. And it concerned her, and it kind of bothered me. And at that time, and I forget who did it. Either she did it or I did, call the Little Rock police. And I explained the situation, or she did, that, I was the attorney and I got this strange phone call. And I would like to have an officer meet me down there. If you know where the house is, but it's not really the best neighborhood in the world, especially at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was nervous about going down there. So when I got down there, and the only light in that whole area was a spot, and there was a police car sitting there. I wheeled over there and explained who I was, and I thought they were there as a result of our call.
Todd Armstrong had been a patrol officer in Little Rock for just 18 months. He had seen crime. He had seen murders. He had never seen what awaited him at 1820 South Main that dreadful morning.
I had been on LRPD for about a year and a half as a patrolman. It was a very stormy night. I was working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift or the midnight shift. Around midnight, the storm rolled through. And I remember this because we had no communication with dispatch. We only had communications with a few other patrol cars in the area. It was a terrible storm, very terrible. And I don't recall the radios going out previous to that or even since that. Because of the storm, myself and Sergeant John Lawrence, he and I were parked across the street from the Markle home. And we were under an awning kind of away from the rain and things. And you're always familiar with your surroundings. So this car pulls up, this headlights hit me, and the car pulls up not too far from my car. He pulls up and he exits the car. I think he's in a raincoat, but I'm not quite sure. But it seemed like he was driving a Volvo station wagon. He said, "Hey, thank you guys for meeting us here." I'm like, "I know nothing about meeting you here. What do you?" He said, "Well, I called dispatch, a few minutes ago and asked an officer to meet me here. I did not know anything about fill me in what's going on." And he said, "Well, my client," and he named, he was an attorney and he had a client named John Markle who called him in a panic and asked him to come immediately to his home. And I said, "Okay." So he accompanied me.
It was amazing to me that after 36 years, police officer Todd Armstrong and personal attorney Richard Lawrence had the same memories of that awful night, and they hadn't even spoken to each other in all those years.
We both went over there, and we went up the steps, and if you know the house, it's sitting up kind of on a rise. It's a hill, a lot of steps going up, and then steps going up to the house, to the porch. As we got up there, we noticed the door was ajar. Well, he got concerned, and I think he unsnapped his pistol. He didn't take it out. And he said, just get behind me.
And I have him kind of, as we get up to the porch, I ask him to step back. And this is a big porch, and it seemed to me like it was kind of a wraparound porch, but we were at the front door. The front door, it had a storm door that was shut, and the door itself, the interior door, was open 6, 8, 12 inches or so, enough that I could see that the home was unsecured. But in my mind, when I saw the door ajar and I saw that briefcase there before I ever entered the house, things started coming together. Is there something very unique and odd about what's going on here? And at that moment, I backed down out of concern we could have a burglary. I didn't know what was going on. I backed down and I asked him a few questions. Is anybody else supposed to be in the house? And he said, yes, he has a wife and 2 children.
Well, he opened the door, and we noticed there, right in the edge of the hallway, was a briefcase. And the briefcase was sitting by the door with a little sign on it with my name on it. You know, that sort of, what's going on here? So the officer, he goes in, and he took 3 or 4 steps in on the hallway.
I looked to the right, and there was a little office or study area there. There's a body laying there. And I immediately backed out and called my sergeant.
And apparently, and I never saw John, never saw his wife, never saw the girls. And I just really looked back and said, I am so glad I never saw. Other officers came in, they toured the house, they found, of course, John downstairs, and they found the girls upstairs and his wife upstairs.
Steve was also there that morning, working as the Pulaski County coroner.
Well, I remember pretty vividly that morning I got there. It was still storming. Lightning wasn't steady lightning, but it was one of those kind of storms where every 30 or 45 seconds there'd be a bright flash of lightning and then thunder. But I went in. I remember going in, and John Markle's body was on the first floor, and it obviously was a suicide, or it appeared to be, even though a little bit later when we found 2 weapons and 2 wounds, it gave us a little bit of concern. But John Markle had lots of blood on him. He had lots of blood evidence that was obviously taken to the crime lab, and there was evidence of family blood that was on him. There was a strong odor of some sort of chemical, maybe chloroform or something, and a couple of the officers smelled it. They never did pinpoint a place of origin of that smell. 2 girls were in one bed. I think that was part of the plan when that scary movie was shown, because I remember there was talk that the younger girl got scared really easily. But the girls were both in bed and they were covered. So I hope that they weren't awake, but you can't hardly imagine how he could shoot one without the other waking up. But I think he did a lot of simul shooting. He had guns in both hands. And so I think that he was firing at the same time. So both of the girls would have been shot at the same time, and they both had fatal gunshot wounds.
That crazy night, with a thunderstorm, the power flickering on and off, the old dark house on the hill, but there was still more.
As we entered the home and saw the body appeared to be deceased and some things around there, we immediately began to search the home. If you can imagine, we enter the front door, which is on the east side of the home facing Main Street, knowing and just anticipating in our minds maybe what we were going to find after we see the body, and we just had in our minds what we might see. So as we enter up to the stairs, but I believe Sergeant Lawrence may have went to the left, which would have been on the second floor, and I may have went a few steps up to the third floor. On the third floor, which was just mainly a bedroom, a bathroom, there was a body of a female that was back across the bed, obviously deceased. If I remember right, it appears to be like the female, if I recall, was laying back from the edge of the bed on her back with her feet or legs hanging over towards the floor.
To this day, no one really knows if she was awake or not, or if she knew who the assassin was behind the mask.
I remember that his wife was sitting on the side of the bed like you would be when you started to get up. But her feet were on the floor, and she was, of course, lying back on the bed. And that led me to believe that she had either awakened or was awake and was standing, perhaps when he shot her. There's a possibility that the 2 girls, as we were walking through this, the 2 girls may have been shot first. And that's what Christine heard, and that's why she was getting up, or that's why she had sat up on the side of the bed. Of course, they all had drugs in them, and the level of the drugs were probably enough that she would have been drowsy. And of course, that was all part of his bizarre plan. It was difficult to tell whether she had been shot after she was lying on the bed or if she was sitting up. I can't recall, actually. And oddly, my own file, which was fairly extensive, was redacted by the Little Rock Police Department, so I can't even read my own file.
Multiple gunshots were fired into each victim. John Markle saved the best for last. After his 4 a.m. phone call to his attorney, Richard, Markle took 2 handguns and fired both of them into both sides of his temples.
I would thought that probably what happened is she was killed first, because if she'd have heard those gunshots, she would have been out of the bed downstairs. So she was probably killed first. And those girls, maybe hearing the gunshots, got into bed together, a stormy night, and that's where he wanted them, is the bed together.
Markle used 3 of the 18 guns that he had in his house: a Colt 45, a Charter Arms 38, and a Colt 38. Christine Markle was shot a total of 3 times. 2 shots at close range were fired into her right eye. The third shot hit her in the right chest. He used 2 38s to kill her. Toxicology on her found that she had Elavil and Valium and THC in her system. Amy Markle was shot a total of 4 times. The first shot was a contact wound to her right upper cheek. There were 2 other shots that were also contact wounds and were to the right side of her head above the ear, and 1 to her upper right chest. All 3 guns were used to kill Amy. Toxicology reported Elavil in her system. Suzanne Markle was lying just to the right of Amy and been shot a total of 5 times, and again, all 3 guns were used. She was shot twice in the upper right chest and 3 times on the left side of her head. All of those were contact wounds. Suzanne also had Elavil in her system.
John Markle was found with 2 gunshot wounds to both sides of his temples. He used the Colt 45 and the Charter Arms 38, fired simultaneously. The toxicology report came back on John and revealed trace amounts of Elavil, Valium. He did test positive for marijuana, trace amounts of alcohol, and an appetite suppressant. Beside him was his suicide note. It read, "Let it hereby stated as true that I, John Markle, murdered my wife and 2 children, Amy and Suzanne, and then committed suicide myself. My wife had no knowledge or part in this. I think the evidence shall prove so." He signed it, John Markle.
You know, being shot in the eye, a lot of times a psychological profiler will tell you that may have had to do with the fact that she saw who did it. It was kind of dark in there, and the power, no telling how long the power had been out and flickering. So, he might have just been firing blindly. And it's what I think happened, that he shot the daughters first, is actually what happened. Then she would have been up and moving around. And although there was no sign that there was any sort of a struggle, I mean, he was a lot larger than she was, and it would have been very easy for him just to push her down and shoot. The shot in the eye may or may not have been some sort of a psychological clue that he left.
We then began to look through the second floor, which was where at least 2 bedrooms, a bathroom were. Obviously, we know we're in a crime scene here. We know something's going on. So we still have 2 girls unaccounted for. As you go in the bedroom, and if you were to look to the right, there was a bed. There was a body of a young child there. Very gruesome. If I remember right, I don't know how to explain it, but there was just blood and just this skin or different things kind of splattered on the wall. Okay, but there's another girl. Where is she? But I back up and I go down the hall, seeing like there was a second bedroom, and I go in there and there's nothing. Where's this other girl? So I go back in that bedroom and around the bed, and there she is. And there's 2 girls in the bed. And again, it's very, very gruesome.
One of the things about the wounds is that most of them were either contact or very near contact. And of course, when you have a near contact wound, there's particulate matters that escape from the channel of the injury as being part of the evidence. We call that blowback. So those things were all investigated and photographed very carefully. And in a case like that, this is what we called a red ball case. And it was red ball because your eyeballs are red from working it.
The suicide note was brief. He admitted he killed his wife and daughters. The note was dated November 16, 1987 at 2:30 a.m. No one knows to this day what John Markle did for the next 90 minutes.
Accounting for his time after what we think was the event, and smart as this guy was, I think maybe he just sat down there in his study, contemplated what he had done and what had brought him to where he was, and he obviously may have reread those notes. I think when the time came, he just made that phone call to Richard, put those guns up to the side of his head, blew his brains out. It was a scene that I'll never forget. And I had a long career, nearly 30 years of dancing with death every day. But this one was one that'll be banked away in the memories for a long time. But I think he wanted it to be final. He wanted it to be everybody. And in his mind, he was performing an act of macabre benevolence.
Shortly after apparently there were people who were wanting to get in the home after the crime scene is completed. And I remember them hiring off-duty officers. And I believe one was Sergeant Matlock, but he was hired to basically guard the home. And I remember, I believe it was Sergeant Matlock told me that people would drive through wanting to pay him so that they could go in the home and visit with spirits.
It's surprising sometimes what your brain remembers, what images lodge deep within your brain.
I do recall as we went back downstairs, and Lord, I don't know if it's a yellow refrigerator or not, but there was a refrigerator, and it seemed like there were some colorings or drawings on the refrigerator that said, "Love you, Mom, love you, Dad."
Mercedes came back to Little Rock one last time to bury her son, her daughter-in-law, and her 2 precious granddaughters. She had nothing to say to the press, but she did speak to the investigators.
I went out and actually interviewed her out in San Diego. She was reluctant for us to come out to her house. She insisted that she would meet at the hotel we were staying at. So when she sat down, I believe I pulled out a tape recorder. I said, do you mind if I record this? And she said, no, if you don't mind me recording you. And she pulled out her own tape recorder, which I thought was kind of spunky on her part. I said, no, not at all. We interviewed her, and that was her assertion, was that all the money was given to him to assist in the children's education and to be invested conservatively in, certificates of deposit or money market accounts, that type of thing. And that when he called her and asked her for the money or a loan of $1 million to cover what Stevens was demanding, she basically told him that, hey, you've made your bed, you're going to have to sleep in it. This was not done with my permission. And I think I even answered, I said, so that was your last conversation. And, you could see that the sadness that came across, and, she acknowledged that was the last time she had spoken.
So what drove John Markle to annihilate his entire family? Former police detective Mike Roche has some insight.
One of the people that we were able to track down that was receiving financial support from him was an individual, and I don't remember his name now, but we went over and interviewed this individual, and he lived in some apartments across the street from the university. He would never allow us inside his apartment, but he spoke to us outside. And he was, somewhat guarded in his responses. But he had told us that he was essentially hired to be the caretaker for this widow and help her with errands and household duties and whatnot, because Markle had seen, the devastation that this suicide had caused to this individual's widow. So I always felt at that point that was such a huge influence in his life that he wanted to make sure that, hey, if I commit suicide, the humiliation of everything that's going to come out afterwards. So I feel very confident that that was his motivation for killing both of his children and his wife before killing himself. Where did the $600 to $1,000 a week cash go? I'd heard, well, perhaps he was spending it on dope, or I'd heard stories that he would give out $100 bills to homeless people, and then obviously he was helping this widow, but $1,000 in spending loot every week, that's, $4,000 a month. That was, a lot of money. And, we didn't know where that went. I felt comfortable that nobody from Gelderman or Elder was directly benefiting outside of, trading commissions. And I think that's all they really cared about, was making the trades. Nobody from Stevens was benefiting from it either.
The house on South Main was cleaned. The personal items were carefully removed. Attorney Richard Lawrence was burdened with the house, the estate, the family pets, all of it.
We were so concerned about all of a sudden his entire family was gone. And I'm looking there like, okay, well, who's going to lock the door? And what about the cat? So basically, my wife Dana and I, we got appointed as the administrator of his estate. And so we basically took over the running of the disillusionment of personal property and cleaning out the refrigerator and the whole 9 yards. And our time for basically a year was tied up with that house, and we ended up, having to do some repairs. And as I recall, had the house for sale. It was sold, and everybody kept talking about he's got some offshore accounts. We looked high and low. We looked every place. We watched, mail coming in, anything that might be an indicator of some sort of bank account that wasn't disclosed. We never, ever found anything.
But Lawrence, while not particularly close to the Markles, had a daughter who was about the same age as Amy, and they were friends.
One of the other things that may or may not be any of the reports, one of my daughters was a good friend of one of the kids, actually had slept over the night before all this happened. She says that she was the last one to see her friend alive. My daughter spent the night on Saturday night, came home on Sunday, and then he took care of this on late Sunday night.
John Markle left 2 notes for Richard with explicit instructions on how to handle the disposal of the bodies. He wanted his family all cremated together in one pile of bodies. If that wasn't freaky enough, he wanted the family pets to be euthanized and cremated with the family.
I would have given anything not to have gone through this, to be honest. And I don't know that I ever got mad at John for putting me in it. I'm doing the best I can to at least respect what he did, but putting the pets down, no. As a matter of fact, we did find homes. We brought one of the cats to our house.
Anytime you see these, what are referred to as family annihilators, there's been a number of them in history that sometimes you can anticipate them, committing their own suicide. But then when they take it further and eliminate the entire family, I don't think those are, predictable events, so to speak. And I don't think anybody I talked to had any foreshadowing of that occurring.
He was angry. Well, it's a wonder, of course, now we see a lot of this as the workplace. You're upset with your boss and all your coworkers, and you go in there and do it. And it's a wonder he didn't try to participate in taking out some of the people that brought him down, I guess.
No, it was a tragic, sad upbringing. I think he harbored a great deal of anger towards her. The final betrayal to him was when he reached out and said, hey, I'm in a desperate situation. And she basically said, hey, you put yourself in that position. I didn't give you that money for that purpose. And you've made your bed and you're going to have to sleep in it. That was it. He hung up the phone on her. To him, I think that was the ultimate betrayal.
John Markle left a 12-page long letter filled with blame, hatred, and final grievances toward the person he blamed most in the world, his mother.
John closed his letter to Mercedes with Night Mother. Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, Mercedes had starred in a play with that same name in Little Rock for the Arkansas Repertory Theater. In the press leading up to the play, which featured a storyline on suicide and a mother and daughter's relationship, Markle said more than anything, the play was about 2 people who loved each other very much, but didn't have the foggiest notion on how to express it. One has to wonder if John, in his madness, realized the play's theme might have been a mirror into his own relationship with his mother.
Mercedes McCambridge would live another 17 years. She acted in a few plays, but she never commented publicly about the crimes. She sued the city, hoping the letter would never see the light of day, but she lost, and the letter was released. Stephen sued for the missing funds, and the estate settled out of court.
The old house still stands today at 1820 South Main on a little hill, a block away from the governor's mansion. Today, the South Main area of Little Rock is being redeveloped, and all the ugliness of the decline of the neighborhood is slowly being erased. To drive by today, one sees a beautiful home built in the early 1900s, and it's well maintained. Only the older residents of Little Rock know what happened the night that John Markle lost his mind and killed his family and blamed his mother. A new family resides in the home today. Life moves on, memories fade, and history is lost.
This concludes this episode of The Coroner's Report, Episode 1, John Markle, An Act of Macabre Benevolence. If you like our content, please remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends. And if you have questions, please reach out to us on our website at thecoronersreport.net or on any social media platform at The Coroner's Report. Special thanks to Richard Lawrence, Mike Roche, and Todd Armstrong for sharing their memories. Copyright 2024 Aussie Grove Media Group, LLC.